A desperate mother grizzly, a helpless cub, and a tourist who never expected to become part of something so heartbreaking. Imagine walking through the untamed wilderness alone, surrounded by towering pines and the crisp mountain air. You take in the silence until it's broken by something unexpected. You freeze. Just ahead, a massive grizzly bear stands in the middle of the trail, staring straight at you. Your heart pounds. This is it. But then she does something no one could have predicted. She doesn't charge. She doesn't growl. Instead, she lowers her head. She looks at you not with aggression but with something even more shocking, desperation. Then she turns her massive body to the side, and you see why. A tiny cub, weak, struggling to move, dying. And in that moment, you realize this mother isn't hunting you. She's asking for help. What happens next? No one was prepared for it. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The air smelled of pine and damp earth as Michael Reynolds adjusted the straps of his backpack and took another deep breath. The trail ahead was rugged, untouched by human footprints, exactly the kind of isolation he had come to Yellowstone National Park for. He had been hiking for nearly 3 hours, weaving through dense forests, feeling the weight of the real world fade with every step deeper into the wild. Michael wasn't a beginner. He knew the rules of the wilderness. He had seen black bears before, even caught a glimpse of a grizzly from a distance once, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. A strange stillness settled over the forest, no birds, no rustling leaves, no sounds at all. Then, a heavy presence. Michael stopped mid-step, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He turned his head slowly, and there she was. A massive grizzly bear stood just 30 feet ahead, blocking the trail. Michael's breath hitched, his entire body locked up. He had read about this moment, what to do, what not to do. No sudden movements. No eye contact. Don't turn your back. Every survival instinct screamed at him to freeze. But something was wrong. The bear wasn't charging. She wasn't even growling. Instead, she stood there, shoulders sagging, sides heaving with heavy breaths. Then she took a step forward. Not aggressive. Not threatening. Just deliberate. Michael felt his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't normal. Then, the moment that sent chills down his spine. The mother bear lowered her head, let out a deep, sorrowful huff, and then looked past him. Michael followed her gaze, and his stomach dropped. A tiny grizzly cub lay near a fallen log, barely moving. Its fur was soaked, matted with dirt. Its breathing, shallow and uneven. It didn't react to its mother's presence, didn't even lift its head. Michael swallowed hard. It was dying. His mind raced. Was it sick? Injured? Had she been trying to carry it but couldn't? And then, as if sensing his thoughts, the mother bear turned back to him. For a split second, their eyes met. She wasn't warning him. She wasn't attacking him. She was asking him. Michael had spent his whole life believing that wild animals feared humans, that grizzlies were unpredictable, dangerous, and instinct-driven. But in this moment, this mother bear was breaking every rule. She was standing in front of a human, not to attack, but to beg. Michael couldn't look away. The weight of the moment pressed down on his chest like a heavy stone. The mother grizzly remained still, her massive frame tense, ears twitching slightly as she listened to the sounds of the forest. She was alert but not aggressive. Every part of her body language suggested the same thing, a silent plea. Michael knew that one wrong move could turn this situation deadly, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore what was happening right in front of him. The tiny cub lay motionless. Its breathing was shallow, its sides rising and falling unevenly. It was too small to be alone, too weak to survive without its mother. And yet, there she was, standing in front of a human as if he was her last hope. Michael considered walking away, continuing his hike as if he had never seen them. This wasn't his problem. But deep down, he knew if he turned his back now, this story would end the way nature had already decided. The cub wouldn't make it through the night, and the mother, he didn't know what happened to a grizzly when she lost her cub, but what he saw in her eyes wasn't just instinct. It was desperation. Michael took a slow breath and weighed his options. He couldn't just walk up to the cub. If he got too close, the mother might react. One wrong step, and a full-grown grizzly would be on him in seconds. There would be no second chances. But then, why was she still standing there? Why wasn't she warning him off? She wanted something from him. He slowly unzipped his backpack, keeping his movements controlled. He pulled out a water bottle and a small piece of dried meat. He knew it wasn't much, but it was all he had. The mother grizzly watched him closely, her dark eyes locked onto his every move. When he placed the bottle on the ground and gently slid it toward the cub, she didn't react. She didn't step forward. She didn't even twitch. It didn't make sense. Grizzlies didn't ask humans for help. But then he understood. She had already tried everything. Maybe she had spent hours looking for food. Maybe she had nudged and pushed her cub, trying to get it to stand. Maybe she had been circling this spot, waiting for something, anything, to change. And now she had done the only thing left. She had placed her trust in a stranger. Michael let out a slow breath and took a step back, giving her space. The forest was silent, the air thick with tension. Finally, the mother grizzly moved. Slowly, she walked over to her cub and nudged its tiny body with her nose. The cub let out a faint, almost soundless whimper. Then the mother turned her gaze back to Michael, and in that moment, he knew she didn't want food. She didn't want water. She wanted him to do something she couldn't. But what? Michael looked at the cub, then at the mother. His mind was racing, trying to grasp the reality of what was happening. He wasn't a veterinarian. He wasn't a wildlife expert. But somehow, this mother bear was looking at him as if he was the only hope she had left. He swallowed hard. If she was willing to trust him, he couldn't just walk away. Now he just had to figure out how to save a grizzly cub before it was too late. Michael's mind raced. The mother bear hadn't moved closer, but she also hadn't left. She stood just a few feet from her cub, breathing heavily, her massive body tense. She was waiting for him to do something. He swallowed hard. He wasn't a veterinarian. He wasn't a ranger. He was just a tourist who had come to Yellowstone to escape the noise of his life back home. But now, in the middle of the wilderness, with no one else around, he had somehow become this bear's only hope. He took another careful step forward. The mother bear didn't react. She watched him but didn't show any signs of aggression. That alone sent a shiver down his spine. Wild animals didn't behave like this. They didn't ask for help. Michael crouched slowly, getting a closer look at the cub. Its fur was damp and matted with dirt. Its tiny body barely moved, its chest rising and falling in weak, uneven breaths. When he placed a hand gently above its muzzle, he could feel the warmth of its breath, but only just. It was barely hanging on. Michael's hands trembled. If this cub had any chance of survival, he had to act fast. He reached into his backpack, pulling out a spare flannel shirt and the water bottle he had placed on the ground earlier. He soaked a small part of the fabric and carefully touched it to the cub's dry lips. No response. His heart pounded. He tried again, letting a single drop of water fall onto the cub's tongue. This time, there was the faintest reaction, a tiny, weak movement of its mouth. It was still alive. But how long would that last? Michael looked up at the mother bear, his throat dry. She was still watching, her body rigid, her breathing steady but strained. She had to be exhausted. How long had she been standing here? How long had she been waiting for something or someone to save her baby? His mind raced through every bit of survival knowledge he had. If the cub was dehydrated, its body temperature was likely dropping as well. It needed warmth. He made a decision. Michael took off his jacket and, with slow, deliberate movements, wrapped it carefully around the small cub. The bear didn't flinch. It was too weak. But the mother, a deep, guttural sound rumbled in her throat. Michael froze. This was the moment. If she saw him as a threat, if she changed her mind about trusting him, it would be over in seconds. The bear took one slow step forward, lowering her massive head toward the small bundle in his hands. Michael's breath caught. Then she sniffed once, twice, and then, as if reassured, she stepped back. Michael exhaled, only now realizing how tightly he had been holding his breath. She was letting him help. But helping wasn't enough. Michael couldn't just sit here, hoping the cub would recover on its own. If it was sick, injured, or simply too weak from hunger, it wouldn't last the night. The nearest ranger station was miles away. There was no guarantee he could even find help in time, which left him with one choice. He had to take the cub with him. The thought sent a wave of unease through his stomach. This wasn't just any animal. This was a grizzly. If the mother changed her mind, if she saw him taking her cub and decided it was a threat, he wouldn't make it out alive. But if he did nothing, the cub would die anyway. Michael swallowed hard. He had come here looking for peace. Now he was about to make a decision that could cost him everything. Michael had made up his mind. The cub wasn't going to survive out here. Not like this. But knowing what he had to do and actually doing it were two very different things. His hands were steady, but his heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him that this was a terrible idea, that he had no business getting between a grizzly mother and her cub, that one wrong move could end this in an instant. But he wasn't backing out now. With slow, deliberate movements, he tightened the jacket around the cub's fragile body. The tiny bear barely reacted. It was too weak, too exhausted. The mother bear shifted her weight, her deep, dark eyes locked onto him. She was still watching, still waiting. Michael hesitated. This was it. If she saw him lifting her cub and decided he was a threat, there would be nothing he could do to stop what came next. He had no way of knowing if she was about to attack, no way of knowing if she understood what he was trying to do. All he knew was that, for some reason, she had let him get this far, and that had to mean something. Slowly, carefully, he slid his arms under the cub's small body. Its fur was cold against his skin. It weighed so little, too little for a grizzly its size. Gently, he lifted it. The mother bear took a step forward. Michael's breath caught. she lowered her massive head, sniffing the cub one last time. Then she let out a low, rumbling sound, something between a grunt and a sigh. And then she stepped back. Michael couldn't believe what he was seeing. She was letting him take her cub. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without warning, she let out a deep, mournful huff and turned away. Michael's stomach twisted. She wasn't following. She wasn't watching anymore. She was walking away. Something inside him ached at the sight. This was her last chance to intervene, her last moment to stop him, but she didn't. She had given up the only thing that mattered to her because, deep down, she knew she couldn't save it. And now she was trusting a human to do what she couldn't. Michael swallowed the lump in his throat and turned toward the trail. The cub was still alive, but for how much longer? He had to move. Michael moved quickly but carefully, his boots pressing into the damp earth as he adjusted the small bundle in his arms. The cub was barely breathing, its tiny body limp inside his jacket. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the mother bear to change her mind and come charging after him. But she was gone, vanishing into the trees as if she had never been there at all. It felt unnatural. Michael had always thought of grizzlies as fiercely protective mothers. He had read stories of them defending their cubs with terrifying strength, standing their ground against wolves, even other bears. So why had she just let him take her cub? The only explanation sent a chill through him. She knew her baby wasn't going to make it. She had tried everything, and when nothing worked, she had done the impossible, turned to a human. Michael swallowed hard and focused on the path ahead. His only goal now was getting the cub to safety. The problem was, safety was miles away. The nearest ranger station was at least 2 hours on foot. There were no roads nearby, no way to call for help. His phone had lost signal hours ago, which meant it was just him and the cub, and time was running out. He pulled the jacket tighter around the tiny bear, hoping to keep it warm. The cub let out a faint sound, barely more than a breath. Michael felt his stomach twist. He didn't know how long it had been without food, without water. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just hiking through the wild. He was fighting against it. And losing wasn't an option. Michael's legs burned as he pushed forward, his breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. He had been hiking for what felt like hours, but the ranger station was still nowhere in sight. The cub in his arms remained unnervingly still, its tiny breaths weak, almost imperceptible against the fabric of his jacket. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind. Was he too late? No. He couldn't think like that. He had to keep moving. He adjusted his grip on the cub, tucking it closer to his chest, trying to share his body heat. It was light, too light for a grizzly cub its age, malnourished, weak. Michael's throat tightened. The mother had known. That's why she had looked at him like that. That's why she had let him take her cub. She had known there was nothing more she could do. Michael stumbled over a tree root, barely catching himself before falling. His head spun with exhaustion, his muscles screaming in protest. He had barely eaten all day, and the weight of the situation, the sheer responsibility of holding a dying life in his hands, was crushing him. Then, through the trees, a flicker of something unnatural, a structure, small, wooden, the ranger station. Michael felt his heart lurch. He forced his body forward, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he didn't bother knocking. He pushed inside, the warmth of the room hitting him instantly. A ranger, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, looked up from his desk, startled. Before he could speak, Michael pulled back his jacket, revealing the tiny, unmoving cub inside. "I need help," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now." The ranger didn't hesitate. In an instant, he was on his feet, moving toward a small cabinet. Michael barely registered the sound of drawers opening and supplies being pulled out. His eyes were locked on the cub. It still hadn't moved. Michael had done everything he could. Now, it was out of his hands. The ranger moved with urgency, his hands working quickly yet carefully as he assessed the tiny, unmoving cub. Michael could do nothing but stand, frozen in place, watching as the fate of the fragile creature now rested in someone else's hands. "How long has it been like this?" the ranger asked, not looking up. Michael swallowed, his throat dry. I don't know. I found it hours ago. The mother, she just let me take it. She didn't fight me. She just walked away." The ranger's eyes flicked up at that, but only for a second. His expression didn't change, and he went back to his examination, checking the cub's breathing, feeling for a heartbeat, gently lifting its tiny paws and pressing against the pads. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Michael barely felt his own body. His hands trembled, his legs ached, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was the fragile life on the wooden table in front of him. The cub looked impossibly small, wrapped in the ranger's flannel blanket. Its fur was still damp from where Michael had carried it against his chest. It wasn't moving. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. This was it. He had carried this cub for miles, through exhaustion, through every shred of doubt screaming at him to turn back. He had trusted that he could do something, that he could make a difference. But what if it hadn't been enough? What if it had all been for nothing? The ranger reached for a bottle of electrolyte solution, carefully tilting a small drop onto the cub's dry tongue. Michael held his breath. 1 second. 2. Then, a flicker of movement, a twitch of its tiny mouth, a weak, almost imperceptible swallow. Michael let out a shaky breath, his entire body sagging as if the weight of the world had just been lifted from his shoulders. The ranger exhaled, setting the bottle down. "It's dehydrated, weak. Probably hasn't eaten in days, but it's still alive." Michael pressed his hands to his face, his vision blurring at the edges. Still alive. Still fighting. He had made it in time. The ranger adjusted the blanket around the cub, rubbing its fur gently. "It's not out of danger yet. We'll need to get it to a wildlife rescue center. There, they can give it proper fluids, medical attention, and get it strong enough to be released." Michael nodded slowly, his mind still reeling. "What are its chances?" The ranger hesitated, then sighed. "Hard to say. Cubs that get this weak, it's a long road back. But you did the right thing bringing it here. You gave it a chance. Without you, it wouldn't have had one." Michael exhaled, his entire body feeling both heavy and weightless all at once. He turned and walked toward the door, stepping outside into the cool mountain air. The sky was changing, the last golden light of the sun bleeding into deep blues and purples across the horizon. The towering trees around the station stood silent, unmoving. The wind had died down. Everything was quiet. Michael looked out at the forest, toward the place where he had last seen the mother bear. Was she still out there? Had she wandered off already, accepting that she would never see her cub again? Or was she still watching from the shadows, waiting for something, anything, to tell her that she had made the right choice? Michael didn't know, and he would never know. The ranger stepped up beside him, his voice quieter now. Sometimes animals understand things we don't. Maybe she knew she couldn't save it. Maybe she just wanted to give it a chance. Michael swallowed hard, blinking against the sharp sting behind his eyes. She trusted me, he said softly. She had no reason to, but she did. The ranger nodded. I've worked with animals my whole life, and I've never seen anything like what you just described. But sometimes nature doesn't follow the rules we expect it to. Michael's throat tightened. That mother bear had done something no wild animal should ever do. She had given up her cub to a human. She had broken every law of instinct, every rule of survival, because she had understood something deeper, something primal, beyond logic. That sometimes, even in the wild, love means knowing when to let go. Michael stared into the trees, his heart aching at the thought of her still out there, alone. He wanted to believe that somehow, she knew. That she had felt the moment her cub swallowed that first drop of water. That she had sensed, deep in her bones, that the life she had fought so hard for had been given a second chance. And maybe that was enough. Michael stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet. He would never forget this moment. The exhaustion, the fear, the pain in his muscles. The way the mother bear had looked at him. The way she had let him take her cub. Not because she was weak. Not because she had given up. But because she had believed in him. And somehow, that belief had been enough to save a life. Maybe, in the end, that was all that mattered. If this story moved you, remember, sometimes the most powerful acts of love come from unexpected places. This mother grizzly did the unthinkable, trusting a human with her cub's life. It's a story of survival, sacrifice, and the deep connection between all living beings. What would you have done in Michael's place? Would you have risked everything to help? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe stories like this need to be told, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. Your support helps bring more powerful and inspiring stories to life. And finally, share this with someone who loves nature and wildlife. Let's spread the message that compassion has no boundaries.